Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Anne. And I'd like really to thank you very much for providing us with this extraordinary platform, bringing us all together from different fields and disciplines to exchange ideas and experiences about such a pressing issue, and hopefully with the aim to make a difference in our desperate world. So I'm going, as the title reveals, I'm going to talk about what's hidden behind the data. We've been talking about the data in the course of yesterday and this morning. We had all these very important papers presented and information. I learned a lot. But as Anne said in an interview with The Guardian, in an ideal world, we shouldn't be really collecting data at all. And let us see what is behind these data. Voices of women from refugee camps. We, the Yazidis, still believe that another invasion will take place because of what we've always been through, because we've always been targeted by other religions and sects. The nightmare of displacement and escape continue to haunt me. Every single night after I fall asleep, I dream of myself carrying my belongings, running, escaping. I wake up shaking, my whole body trembling in fear, and I say, thank God, it's just a nightmare. The nightmare of displacement will always haunt me and haunt my people. I am sitting here thinking very seriously that I should get creative and write a letter addressing the whole world on the anniversary of the 3rd of August. That's the ISIS attack on Sinjar, which is called the Black Day by the local people. Writing a letter and tell the whole world that we have suffered beyond words. We have lost everything. For 4 long years, I've been fighting fear, hunger, grief, and disease. I've been fighting cold, poverty, and pain, and I do not ask for anything but to live in peace, to live safely. But who would hear our cries when the whole world is stone deaf? This is part of a story by a Yazidi woman from the Ashti camp in Arbat, Iraqi Kurdistan region. Another story from a Sunni woman from Al-Zawr village in central Iraq. I am from Al-Zawr village, which was subjected to the ISIS attack in 2014. People in my region had lost many things. There were those who lost their homes and their possessions. There were those who lost their lands and orchids. There were others who lost their relatives, friends, and families. But me, I lost everything. I lost my home, I lost my orchid, I lost my neighbors, my relatives, my brother and father. I lost even my husband who abandoned me during the hardest time. I lost my life as a whole because of the circumstances that led me to the camp. I am lost. In the camp, my children were crying because they were hungry. My husband did not care about them, although he had money. I had to go and beg from neighboring tents to get food for them. The gap between me and my husband widened. I could no longer stand his abuse and his beating, and decided to go and live with my mother and my brother's widow with her 6 children in the same tent. Nothing matters to me now, and I don't care about my future. I don't whether I go back home or spend the rest of my life in the camps. All I care about is to make ends meet. Researching forced displacement. So the testimonies you heard are taken from 2 real stories of internally displaced women in Iraq who live in the Ashti camp, as I said, in Arbat, in the Kurdistan region. I collected them during fieldwork on a piece of research addressing gender-based violence and displacement. According to the UNHCR spokesperson, there are nearly 15 million Syrian and Iraqi refugees, as well as internally displaced people scattered across the Middle Eastern countries, including 13 million Syrians. Only 1 million could make their way to Europe. The rest of the displaced and refugees are scattered in different Middle Eastern countries. The countries that are concerned are Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Iraq, and Iraqi Kurdistan region. And there are some, of course, in some African countries like Egypt and Libya. Around 2 million live in Iraqi Kurdistan region. For those who may not know Iraqi Kurdistan region, this is a region, it's not a state. Since 2005, according to the Iraqi constitution, it's recognized as a semi-independent region within Iraq. Some people refer to it as northern Iraq still. It's got its own parliament, its own government, with basic infrastructures. The region has faced a lot of economic and political challenges. And also Iraq as a whole, but Kurdistan region in particular, are considered as post-conflict areas going through the reconstruction process. Iraqi Kurdistan region even still in the healing process after the genocidal operations of the former Iraqi regime led by Saddam Hussein and many consecutive wars. I am mentioning these in order to tell you and to tell us that the precarious situation and vulnerability of refugees and IDPs also affected by the precarious situation and vulnerability of the host society. And in this case, in Iraqi Kurdistan region, where I conducted most of my field work. Generally, based on my research, generally in the Middle East, 4 million refugees and IDPs at an extreme risk. So the research concerns forced displacement of people who fled war and destruction to save their lives. They are not seeking a better life. Many of them walked among dead bodies, saw their family members shot dead in front of them. They carry the heavy weight of loss and destruction, and they survive in isolation and misery in the camps. The paper I'm presenting here is a qualitative piece of research on gender-based violence and displacement in the UK and in the Middle East, more particularly in Iraqi Kurdistan region. This piece of research is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, as well as Arts and Humanities of the British Council. I've been leading the Middle Eastern part of the project. It's conducted collaboratively with scholars and human rights advocates in Iraqi Kurdistan region. In the last 10 months, I, together with the local team, have been conducting fieldwork in the region, focusing on many aspects of gender and displacement, including sexual and gender-based violence. And we investigated women's and boys' experiences of displacement and life in the camps. We looked at the existing conditions of refugees and displaced communities in 5 camps, met with displaced girls, women, boys in the camps. We held meetings with them, had group as well as one-to-one discussions, developed workshops and training, including 5 art projects. Gendering displacement. Gender plays an important role in all aspects of the experiences of refugees, migrants, and displaced people. Their displacement process involves different challenges and risks with different needs and consequences. However, gender still remains at the margin of the global migration and refugee policy agendas. It was interesting to see the cover of our program, the picture of a woman with her suitcase. Usually it doesn't go like that. They just run away and try to save their lives. So in the academia, it's been well integrated with very little resources. So in the academia, we've been trying to see how does gender interact with migration and displacement. In other words, how does gender shape women's displacement journey and how the boundaries between being a woman and being a man shifting through the displacement process? What are the power dynamics in the camps and during the displacement process? How this affects gender roles and gender relations? And most importantly, how to mainstream IDP, that's internally displaced persons, and refugee gender issues into policy. These are very important questions to ask when dealing with migration, displacement, and policy. There is no doubt that the answers to these questions with a critical perspective deepens our understanding about the interaction between gender and displacement and could contribute to a more effective policy at local, regional, as well as international level. In order to answer these questions with deep insight, we need evidence-based data. Data that emerge from the experiences and realities of those affected by forced displacement and migration. And evidence-based data requires support and resources for qualitative research, involving trips to the concerned countries with field work, including in-depth interviews, face-to-face encounter, and interaction with local people and their experiences. Data emerging from such a research could help us to get a better insight into the complexities and problematic conditions of refugees and displaced communities. And contextualizing their experiences and integrating them into global economic and political development agenda lead to a more effective policy. When we talk about migration or refugees and displaced persons, we need to bear in mind that we are not talking about one single coherent unified category. This is how media and political populist discourse trying to depict them, creating fear and distrust. These kinds of representations lead to generalist and less effective strategy that bypasses gender and other intersection categories and factors. So the research I conducted was not a classic investigation with an attempt to go there, do some interviews, come back and do data analysis behind my desk. No. My local research group and I adopted new methodologies, including knowledge co-production, considering intersection categories within refugees and displaced communities. And for those who may not know, knowledge co-production in this research is a way of working together with refugees and displaced community members, leading to produce different and sometimes unexpected forms of knowledge of value and social relations. It can be defined as an exploratory space and a generative process between academics and refugees, placing equal value on academic and community knowledge and expertise. So the outcome of this approach is that my team and I worked closely with displaced and refugees explored their experiences, consulted them about their skills, their inspirations, and produced with them 5 art projects, including photography, painting, theater, music and song, as well as creative writing and storytelling, where the examples I read at the start of my presentation come from. We produced 2 books, which will be published soon, hopefully at the end of the year. And the books are written and narrated by refugee and displaced women. So they are actors, not subjects of our study. The 2 books will be published, especially the storytelling, which is called, the title is Shattered Hopes. It's a cry from the heart. I really invite you all to read this book, especially the stories of the Yazidi women. They are just cries calling upon us, calling upon our humanity. We also produced a number of paintings, photographies, and a clip with songs and music by Syrian refugees in Shawis camp in Erbil. At the end of my presentation, Barry is going to present some of the paintings produced by the Yazidi girls, the Yazidi girls who had been abducted by ISIS jihadists following the attack of Sinjar in 2014. They've been subjected to sex slavery. Some of them were ransomed back, and they live currently in Sharia camp in Duhok. So the paintings are produced by these girls. At the end of my presentation, Barry will present them as slideshow. So throughout the different phases of the research, we considered intersection categories and factors, because I believe that intersectionality is fundamental when conducting research about gender-based violence in general, and gender-based violence and displacement in particular. People's experience of displacement and gender-based violence is affected by their race, by their age, by their status, whether they are married, whether they are single, whether they are rural, or whether they've been working, illiterate. Many of the people that we worked with are they are illiterate, and some of them had very basic level of reading and writing, and their stories were told. We recorded them, and then we tried to write them and then go back to them, read it, and then edit it. It's been a long process. It's been a long process, but the outcome is impressive, and hopefully can lead to some effective policy in the area. I'm going to, in this slide, I put everything together. I would like just to present some emerging themes from this research as a preliminary finding. The refugees and displaced people, as I said, in the Middle East, carry many cultural and historic specificities, and the causes and needs and consequences of their displacement are shaped by their ethnic, religious, linguistic, and gender differences. The risks women face, their vulnerabilities and needs are shaped by their being women with problematic gender relations. In the camps, they are isolated, they are excluded, and don't have access to services, don't have access to mobility, nor to cultural or any kinds of social activities. almost all the women we talked to had been subjected to gender-based violence, including early and forced marriages, honor-based violence, beating, verbal abuse, sexual violence, sex trafficking, and abuse by corrupt agents and smugglers. Although none of the meeting discussion raised the issue of sex trafficking and prostitution, because these are taboo subjects and people don't feel at ease to talk about them. But our informal discussions with administrators and activists, as well as our literature review, concluded that human trafficking and sex exploitations have been practiced inside IDP and refugee communities. Vulnerable girls and women are subjected to corrupt agents using them and their bodies for their own end, including prostitution. And the Iraqi, as well as KRG, Kurdistan Regional Governance Institutions, while they are punishing victims of sex trafficking, they don't have enough, they haven't made enough effort to combat this practice. This is a subject that needs further investigation. It's indeed a pressing subject to be considered by policymakers and funders. Those who had been abducted and subjected to sex slavery, like the Yazidi girls, they come back to their communities. They are protected, they are not killed according to the traditional understandings of women's bodies and sexualities. They are accepted by their families, but they haven't been provided with protection, they haven't been provided with integration or any kinds of psychological treatment, and they all suffer from post-trauma syndromes. Some voluntary and international NGOs address the issue, but the extent of the problem is beyond their capacity. The art projects we developed with them was a kind of therapy for many of them, and also created a space for a better and more civilized interaction between boys and girls. These are temporary and not long-term solutions. Our study demonstrates that women in the refugee camps face many physical and mental health problems. Reproductive health is a major serious problem in the camps. Most married women suffer from gynecological problems. There is no specialized doctor working in the camps. There is no maternity unit, no ultrasounds in any of the camps. Women are, who approach labor are sent to Slemania, which are about 25 to 30 kilometers away from the camp. They are sent there in order to be treated and to deliver. Most of them deliver on their way to Slemania. And we have also cases of the pregnant women who died during their trip to hospitals in Slemania. Another important aspect is related to the to loss. Loss is an essential aspect of the experiences of displacement and refugees in the camps. Almost all the women in the camp raised it in their stories. Loss of home, loss of land and possessions, loss of family members, loss of their youth, of their life, as you heard from the stories that I read. So many of the women who participated in our project lost their family members and carry the weight of death, and they didn't have the opportunity to go through grieving processes, and they live with this heavy pain heavy weight of pain and suffering inside the camps. Our art projects helped a group of women to express their pain and anguish. Narrating and acting and painting also have been received very positively. So our study found that the impact of art in overcoming isolation, trauma, and suicidal ideation is important. But the extent of the problem, as I said, is such that without state intervention and adequate policies and international rights frameworks, NGOs and voluntary sectors cannot prevent death and the degeneration of the situation. Also, our research found that men are also victims. They are jobless, isolated, depressed, and with the traditional power dynamics of gender norms and their imagined masculinity, which is shifting but not perceived and integrated, they are destabilized and turn into violence. And this violence, most of the time, is practiced on women's bodies and sexualities. Some of them take refuge in religion and extreme forms of religious practices, which can result in terrorism. These men also need aid intervention, development and awareness raising programs. They need a comprehensive program based on human rights framework with protection and empowerment measures, as well as education programs. So through the lens of gender and by contextualizing women's experiences, we can have a better insight into the power dynamics, into the complexities and problematic conditions of refugees and displaced persons. Understanding these complexities is essential for those who seek to deal with the issue and set up strategies to address it. My concluding remarks can take the shape of some recommendations. Before that, I would like to reiterate that my research concerned forced displacement in the Middle East, where different displaced groups are regrouped, put in the camps. They are Yazidis, they are Sunnis, they are Arabs, Christians, Shabaks, Turkmen, Kurds. They all fled civil war, they fled armed groups and terrorism. So they live together in the camp, but they carry the history of distrust and conflict among themselves. In the case of Yazidis, for example, we noticed that they were fearful and not wanting to interact with Muslims. The Sunnis didn't want to interact with Shi'is and sit with them in the meetings and workshops. The Kurds didn't want to interact with Turkmens. So these are the realities of these people who put together in the camps. The situation, of course, leads to further isolation, exclusion, and often the outbreak of violence. The study suggests that support programs and interventions can consider this point and motivate solidarity between different religious and ethnic groups with the aim to reduce tension between people from different backgrounds and prepare the terrain for positive human relationships and better implementation of aid programs. In our case, different forms of art could bring them together and create a space for cohabitation and peaceful interaction between different groups, as well as between boys and girls. This is a positive example. Our study also demonstrates that the main 8 categories regarding women throughout their displacement journey should include empowerment through education and awareness raising programs, protection, health, legal and social services. So the study recommends that policymakers, international organizations and refugee rights advocates adopt a gendered human rights approach with the aim to fight gender inequality and injustices. Empowerment, of course, is important. Protection and support are much needed. But how to challenge gender inequality and injustice if governments do not institutionalize gender equality for refugees and migrants, integrating them into their policies and legislative reforms? So this is a very serious issue to be considered. What is a gendered human rights approach? A gendered human rights approach requires institutionalization of migration based on principles of gender equality. The approach involves fair programs enabling women to benefit from safe and regular support, and empowering programs, for example, developing guidelines, setting up special health, judicial, police units in the camps to provide legal, health, and social support, and also services. When I was writing about this, I remember my work on honor-based violence, and I discussed that with Anne, and encouraged me to talk about it. You remember honor-based violence or honor crimes 20 years ago, it was not talked about. There were women killed inside their families, their communities, in the name of honor. Governments and international human rights organizations used to consider them as private or cultural issues and left them for the communities to deal with. But of course, sorry, this is very sensitive, that led to further violence and honor killings inside many communities throughout the world. So when I started work on this subject with my colleagues at the Center for Gender and Violence Research, we advised governments. I personally was on the board of an advisory group with the Metropolitan Police, trying to advise them how to deal with this situation, which is very sensational, and invited media to talk about it in a way that created further gap and distrust among different ethnic and religious groups. How am I doing with time? Yeah, let me just finish this slide. So the comparison is, well, we'll discuss about it later, but the comparison is important because what we suggested and how the governments try to integrate measures made a difference in terms of saving women's lives when it came to honor crimes. So as I said, also one of the findings of this research that regional countries that have hosted displaced and refugees in the Middle East don't have always enough resources nor institutional capacity to meet the needs of these desperate and traumatized populations. These countries need to be supported and provided with resources and monitoring measures in order to be able to deal with the extent of the crisis. Another important recommendation concerns the use of international rights frameworks, integrating these issues into the, for example, CEDAW and the UN Convention 1325. This requires strengthening these frameworks and holding states that sign them accountable, inviting governments to ratify and implementing them. Promoting gender equality does not only help create a more egalitarian society with individuals having a sense of justice and well-being, but also help prevent the outbreak of future violence and conflict. Seriously, the situation harbors such a potential. If not properly addressed, it can lead to further outbreak of violence and terrorism. One of the ways of achieving this is to invite and encourage women to take part in peace processes, in conflict resolutions as stipulated by the UN Convention 1325. 25. Also, encouraging cultural and artistic projects inside displaced communities is very important. Creativity and knowledge, based on my experience, lead not only to express their anguish and sufferings and can be used as a therapy, but also provide refugees and displaced people with a kind of self-realization and self-esteem, and a kind of power through which they could resist and face the difficulties of their daily lives. This is shown through the writing process by women in the Ashti camps and also by Yazidi girls. What's more, the voices of women in the stories have historic values. They talk about incidents and events that you don't hear about it if you don't read these stories. And they are facts, and these facts are absent in the official discourse and media representation of refugees and displaced people. Another aspect of the stories is that they talk all about the past. There is no dream, no hope, no word about the possibility to get out of the camps and live peacefully in a place that can be called home. Finally, and I will end here, I deeply feel that the voices of the girls, women, and boys who participated in my research and the research in general are not only about them and about their painful displacement journey, they are also about us, about our humanity. They are also about the global injustices and the role we all play in a way or another in creating this situation. For we are all, in a way or another, responsible in what's going on around us. I am sure you, like me, like all of us, are disturbed by pictures of drowned children hunted on the Mediterranean shores. Isn't it our responsibility as policymakers, human rights advocates, international organizations, and academics to join our forces and work together in order to provide these people with hope and with faith in humanity? Thank you.
Thank you. That was a very powerful presentation. I think what I'd just like to observe is that what it speaks to me in relation to data is that if we rely only on the data generated from official sources at the moment through censuses, through the questions that are currently asked, the policy gaze will continue to miss these realities. And so we won't have appropriate services, medical services, because there's no awareness of the medical health needs, of the psychological needs of people in the camps, of the women who are experiencing these traumas. And also that it will continue to reproduce the conditions and the lack of services that are resulting in such human suffering. So I think it may seem that this is not a session about data, but it's very much a session about the data which are not being collected and the reasons why the policy gaze is missing. The policies are missing so many of the actual human needs that we need to address. So I hope that we could have a discussion now about how we might learn from that, work about the need to work with NGOs to do the kind of grounded research that academics do in this kind of quite very brave work and very traumatic research, how to learn the lessons that are appropriate to changing and shaping policies that will actually produce a better situation for the future. If anyone has any observations, please indicate, and we can have a discussion about that now, about how we could move this forward to ensure that we're not continuing to miss these human realities. This is just one example of what's missing from the official data. I just want to say, is it working? Yeah.
Just want to say a word about these paintings. So these paintings are produced by Yazidi girls, as I said. Some of them are illiterate. Many of them never handled colors and crayons and never painted. So we hired a painter to coach them for 8 weeks, and they produced these paintings at the end of the workshop, of the training course. So while it's running, if you have any questions, I'll be pleased to answer them.
So a quick question about, does your research include all age groups of women in your research area, or you focus on especially adults or adolescents? So this is the first question. And the second one is out of my personally curiosity. I found when we mentioned about refugees, especially refugee women, I find I have preconceived ideas about they are very poor, they are living in a very harsh condition, and they are pessimistic. I mean, these kind of pre-existing ideas always affect my interpreting of the data. So I'm wondering whether these kind of ideas will have an effect of your interpreting of the data, especially for these kind of like paintings or music you mentioned before. For me, I think blue always give me an idea of pessimistic or gloomy weather, so I may interpret it as a sad story or something. So this question is about my personal curiosity. Thank you.
Any more?
Thank you very much for your very powerful presentation. I don't know, a few days ago, I watched a film. It's 21. It's a film made by a Chinese director recording the Second World War female sex slaves. I don't know whether I can draw a parallel here. From seeing from the film, I think. It is recording what they experience, or recording how they recover from the whole trauma. Might be a way to move forward. It's just my own. It's just my own question. I don't really know. It's an open-end question. I don't know whether they say that is a way forward or not, but the film director, he mentioned that might be a way to move forward. And in the film, I see although they just like those girls, those women in China, they also experience horrible things. And what was important from the film was, I think, love and beauty in the world still persist in the end. I want to hear what you think. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. About the age group, we consider to include girls and women aged 17 upwards. The reason why we didn't consider younger than 17s is because of the legality issues. Although we were aware that there were girls, especially among the Yazidi girls, who were younger and they were abducted, but because of the judicial and legal frameworks, we couldn't include them in the project. Having said that, while we were conducting our creative writing course, one of the participants had 2 guests staying with her, and the 2 guests, one of them was 14 and the other one 17. they got very interested in participating, and they insisted that they would like, they wanted to tell their stories. So after consultation with the principal investigator, we decided to include these girls, although one of them was 14. And so the other one is about pre-existing perceptions about the tragedy and miserable life of refugees and IDPs. What I presented here is just the reality. These are the experiences of the people that I encountered, I talked to, and the two first slides were their words, their wordings. These are not preconceived ideas, unfortunately. These are the experiences of the refugees and IDPs, especially in the camps. And regarding of course, I mean, you asked whether I consider including these preconceived information in my analysis. As I said, this is a qualitative piece of research, and based on in-depth interviews, on meetings, consultations, and long analysis with all the data that we collected. It's not based on preconceived ideas and information. The other question is about the World War and the film that you saw. Well, it's sad. That means we haven't really made progress. We haven't, as human beings, humanity has not moved forward. It's still reproduced.
Yeah, I think I'd just like to add there that I think what is very important is to take from this the lesson about when we talk about data, very often it's assumed we're talking about quantitative data, about official data. We've focused on administrative data, surveys and censuses. There's another type of data, the qualitative data that are generated from this type of research. And I think this can give you the understanding of the dynamics and perceptions and insights into that help to explain what the needs are around migration for policy, regarding policy. So we need both. We need these different types of research, different types of data and different types of analysis to understand in a multidimensional way the realities of the human needs of people who are migrating or in migrant situations. And I think what this presentation has made very clear is that the whole gendered dimension so often, and for the group that you were interviewing, is brutal and is very painful for women. It's not necessarily the case for all women, and this is one specific, but sadly, this needs to be addressed, and it's very often an area that is ignored in migration policy. We had a session in the OECD meeting that we held in January, a joint international conference of the OECD, IOM, UNDESA, when there's one session was on female genital mutilation. And we had to argue very strongly in the planning meeting to have that session included as being relevant to migration. And I think this is still a discussion that needs to go on in policy areas, in NGOs, in academic research, to bring these realities to the forefront of our discussions. So I'd just like to wrap up there now and say thanks very much to Nazand. Sorry, there's another question there.
Thanks, it's very interesting. I was working in Iraq before Cairo, so I I know this context pretty well. Just some comments to enrich the discussion more than questions. One thing, it's very true that women are many times not included in migration policies, or there's not enough attention. But also I would like to say that especially in conflict situations, men are very vulnerable too. And especially, I was working with IOM Iraq, and I was the research coordinator. So we did a few research, one on, joining armed groups, mobilization into armed groups. It started with countering violent extremism, and then it became just joining armed groups. And men who have lost jobs, who are not the breadwinners for their families, who are at risk of being of joining armed groups to recuperate a status or a role in their communities. They are more at risk of irregular migration because they are the ones who try the crossing more than women. So especially in conflict situations, I think men are also very vulnerable. And I don't know in the academia sector, but in the UN sector, it's almost a taboo to talk about men and vulnerability. It's all about women and children. So this is not to neglect women and children, but also to consider men. That was one point that I wanted to make. And there was another point. Anyway.
So this was one of the findings of my research, actually. Thank you.
Oh yes, and the other point is that another point about vulnerabilities, and this is very good that you mentioned that this is camps, because also there is a need to understand IDPs are very vulnerable in most situations. Now, Iraq is a case, for example, where 8% used to live in camps. It increased after Mosul. It went about up to 30% because of all the people fleeing Mosul. But for the 3 years of the emergency before Mosul was retaken, it was about 8%. And those are the very vulnerable ones. The other ones are people who managed to live in rented flats for 2 years. And of course, they are vulnerable, but in other ways. The needs are not the same. It's not that they are in need of food or water. These are people who can afford to pay a rent for 2 years. They've lost their honor, they've lost their respect, they've lost their dignity, they haven't lost bread and water, and they found other jobs. So it's also very important not to box them all in one categories, because we risk from the humanitarian point of view to provide assistance in a blanket way, everybody the same, without understanding what are the real needs. Oh, sorry, and the third point was that we're also doing another study in Iraq. It's a longitudinal study on a sample of 4,000 IDP families displaced in 2015. And we also have a health module that has self-perceived physical health and mental health. We just started analyzing the data, but what was interesting, what came out from the preliminary analysis is that these families, and these are all IDP displaced in communities, not in camps, they are very aware of their mental health issues. And this is a surprise for, at least for me, because physical problems are more visible and people are more open to talk about their physical problems, but mental health may still be considered a taboo in such contexts, but it's not, apparently. People are very aware that they're facing mental,
Yeah, they are very aware, and they ask for help. Yes. In the case of Yazidis, for example, and also the women in the Ashtika, the women who told their stories, they asked us about providing them with counseling programs and psychological treatment, because they realized that these kinds of programs could make a difference in their lives, and they are desperate. The other thing is about IDPs and refugees. This is a very serious issue, really, that needs to be addressed by international organizations and different UN agencies, because the international rights framework, is more supportive towards refugees, while IDPs' needs and vulnerabilities are not always addressed. Although in the camps, in some of the camps that I worked in, they are put together. You have Syrian refugees and Iraqi IDPs living in the same camp, and because they live together, they benefit from the same kinds of social and cultural activities, but it's not always the case when they live alone in separated camps. And I would like also to add that you have a group of people, IDPs and refugees, live in the camps. They are in camps inhabitants, but you have off-camp inhabitants. There are those who don't have any places in the camps, so they live in the margin of the host societies. They try to rent rooms and cheap houses in the suburban areas, and they work very cheap, and some of them, of course, vulnerable and subjected to prostitution. This is also an important case that needs to be considered. And about the avoiding binarism between men perpetrators and violent and criminals, and women are always victims. As I mentioned, this is one of our findings, and we are going to elaborate it and put it as one of the recommendations in our action plan. Because if this is not addressed, I remember, some of the boys were saying, we don't have anywhere to go. We only have mosques and religion. So that tells a lot, because they don't have any cultural or support programs. They think that everything is addressed to women, which is not true, but international organizations have been more supportive towards women, especially in the case of the Yazidis. But men's need to be seriously addressed, of course.
Yes, thank you very much. I think we'll continue the discussions over lunch and during the next couple of days. Yeah.